Welcome to our afternoon session with what's hopefully going to be a lively question and answer session with the two of the Finney7 chaps. I've been looking forward to this one for the last hour or two. My name's Nick and I'm going to be hosting the session with my co-host Steve. So can I just take you through a little bit of housekeeping before we get the ball rolling? If you wouldn't all mind remaining muted unless you're invited to, unmute yourselves to ask a question. We'd like that because we don't really want to hear the football commentary or your dog or your telephone going in the background. The next thing I suggest is that you change your Zoom setting to speaker view. In the top right hand corner up there, you've got an option to toggle between gallery or speaker view, and we've tried to set it up so you get the best experience in speaker view. And we want you to ask lots and lots of questions, but to do so, can you use the chat function down at the bottom? If you hover around that, you'll see a chat function comes up, and if you could just type your questions into that and address them to everyone, and then we can pass the questions on to Steph and Richard. So that's great. So what we did last time, we commenced the meeting by inviting Steph and Richard to say a little bit about themselves and Finney7, and we'll get the ball rolling. So over to you, Steph, seeing as you were on the screen.
Oh, I did it last time. Richard can go first this time. I'm feeling generous.
Off you go then, Richard.
I'm Richard Lambert. I was instrumental in putting Finney7 group together. My responsibility is to run Finney7 on a day-to-day basis, deal with some of the ordering for suppliers, make sure we have enough stock in, and act as the first port of call for people to ask questions, to order kits, talk to me about kits or perhaps any problems they might have, either through telephone or email contact via the website.
Thanks, Richard. I'm Steph Dale. I'm involved with Finney7 both in terms of managing our supply chain and also in terms of doing design work for the organisation. So my role over the last few years has primarily been associated with reintroducing the original Martin Finney kits, together with the first couple of our new kits, which were the LNER W1 and the drum and boiler version of the Adams radial. I'm involved in this. It matches quite well with my day job and my responsibilities. I'm a manufacturing engineering consultant is my day job, so this is very much an extension of the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. And it gives us a great opportunity in terms of being able to work with commercial and industrial suppliers on a very even footing, because they are dealing with us as they would another business rather than being hobbyists, which has been enormously beneficial over the last few years. That's it from me, I think.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much for that, Steph. As I've just been saying, if anybody wants to ask a question of Richard and Steph, please type your questions into the chat box down at the bottom and address them to everybody, and I'll pass your questions on to them straight away. So one of the questions we got asked this morning, which I think is probably worth going over again, was when is your B1 kit coming out? Because I want one.
Sometime relatively shortly, I think. We're at the stage whereby the etches are sorted out, all the design work for the casting has been completed. So we're at the position where we need to productionize the new castings, do a test build, write the instructions. So we're not promising anything immediately, but we are working on it, and the end is in sight, I think.
I think that's a fair appraisal. I mean, it's also worth mentioning at this point, perhaps, that we've got the kit for the 9400 Great Western pannier tank is at the same stage, pretty much. So we're progressing those two. In terms of where we are with those, Nick, the fun and games with that at the moment is because we've still got the last of the reintroductions to do for the Great Western kits, which we inherited from Martin Finney. They're not far off now, but that is the focus of my time, is to make sure that we reintroduce the kits first before we start progressing through introducing new kits.
There's a chap called Graham that keeps lifting his hand up. Graham's iPad, I think you're called. Did you want to specifically ask a question? Oh, I'll take that as a no then. Okay. Moving on. One of the things I've always been quite interested in was that you obviously, when you took over Finney7, took over a company that was regarded as one of the Premier League O-gauge kit suppliers, and I just wondered what you'd thought about a legacy for Martin's kits. I mean, in my view, some of the kits the W1 kit that you brought out, your own standalone kit, was actually, I thought, very good. And I wondered how you felt about the, Martin's legacy, and how you were looking towards, raising the standards a little bit.
Richard, do you want to start with that one, and then I'll come into how it affects what we do moving forward?
Well, the first thing to say is that the members of Finney7 are all very competent modelers who are keen to do the best they can. So we recognised when we acquired Martin's kits, there was a standard there that we had to at least match going forward. So anything that we did had to be as good or better, or really wouldn't have been any point in getting involved. So we're very keen to make sure that in terms of quality of components, ease of fit, improvement to the instructions, that we're able to take it forward and build on what Martin did, rather than try to invent something else again.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question then, Richard? Is there ever any compromise between the accuracy and perhaps the ability to make it work, or whatever?
Well, there are always going to be compromises, because you're trying to get something at a minimum around a 6-foot radius curve, when some of the prototypes might struggle. What I would say is that we try and make the absolute minimum of compromises in the design to ensure that it looks as good as the original does. So, and the other one, of course, is that they're designed for normal 32mm track. So you've then immediately got particularly differences in the chassis, potentially some sort of difficulties with inside valve gear in making sure that can fit. So we make the minimum number of compromises possible, but there are inevitably going to be compromises.
Okay.
Do you make compromises to, so that people that have got perhaps a more modest ability are able to tackle them as well?
You want to say that, Steph?
I think I don't know that it's something that we consider as a discrete element, Nick. What we certainly are conscious of is that one of the great selling points for the kits is the fact that they are accurate in their construction. So for a less experienced builder, the great advantage that you have in the context of the kits that we do, particularly now, is that you've got very well illustrated instructions. But the other thing is that, I mean, it sounds amazing that we're using this as a selling point, but the parts fit together. You don't need to adjust stuff to get them to fit. And if you do, maybe it's associated with a particular variant in the kit, then the details of what you need to do are provided in the instructions frequently with templates or other guidance as to what changes you need to make. So they are, from that point of view, particularly some of the simpler kits, are entirely credible to be built by first-time builders. And I think the M7, which I've got as my backdrop, is potentially one of those.
Right. So you would say that the kit behind you, the M7, would be kind of a perfect kit for somebody that's, you know, not got much experience of an etched brass kit or soldering or.
I would say somebody who is ambitious and careful, and perhaps has built etched brass wagon or something of that nature. I think it's entirely credible to do as a first-time loco build, because it is literally a case of following the instructions.
Sure, sure.
I mean, I've built one in P4 in about 40 to 50 hours. So it's not a massive project. You know, it was great pleasure to do, I don't know, 20 years ago as a holiday break for me.
If I can come in there, we have one customer who's doing our Duchess kit as the first ever kit build in any scale. Now, yeah, it's involved quite a few phone calls and a bit of explanations and pointing at websites, but he has actually done it, and he's made a very, very good fist of it. Because if you follow the instructions carefully, they're quite difficult to get wrong. You know, if something doesn't fit, the chances are you've picked up the wrong part or are trying to fit it in the wrong place. So I do think that they are all capable of being built fairly easily, providing that you take your time and don't rush it. They're not quick builds because there are a significant number of parts, but they're not difficult builds, providing you take your time over them.
Yeah, this is with me technical committee hat on. This is one of the questions that we get asked a lot. You know, recommendations for a starter kit. You know, for somebody who's dipping their toe into the sort of kit building area for the first time. And you know, whilst it's not really fair for, you know, members of the guild technical committee to make recommendations of whose kits people should or shouldn't buy, I kind of always think that, you know, perhaps that Finney7 are a good choice, because one of the biggest problems I think of building kits that people encounter is that there are always faults in the kit, that some of the parts physically don't go together, you know, and there are a few kit manufacturers that are notable for that, and there are some kit manufacturers equally that aren't notable for that, and you're one of them, really. You know, I think even if the kit looks complex, at least if the parts will go together, at least if everything's the right size and shape, that's a massive advantage. You know, you're not left scratching your head wondering how this firebox is going to fit, or what I've got to do to the roof to make that fit, and so on.
I mean, in terms of being impartial, Nick, just for a second, because I can be if I need to be. I'm recognising that they do a range of prototypes which we don't and would not be likely to do. The other one which comes up in conversation a lot is Connoisseur, in terms of good introductions to 7mm building. And I'm certainly confident that if somebody came to us having put together one of the Connoisseur etched brass wagon kits, that with Richard's help on the phone, and approaching the instructions and the build carefully, but yes, pretty much any of the kits that are in our range would be achievable by a relatively inexperienced builder. It's also worth adding, actually, that the 9400 that we're due to bring out has a self-jigging chassis, so it's not even as though you would need you know, an axle jig or anything similar in order to get the chassis together. It is literally a case of you fold it up, you run some solder around, and you drop the wheels in. So, you know, we're looking at different ways of reducing the burden on the builder to the point where perhaps we can look more at how the casual enthusiast might build one of our kits.
Right.
We are aiming the 94XX. I wouldn't necessarily say the absolute beginner's market, but at that sort of end of the market. And as Steph rightly says, the chassis has these self-jigging items in. But in terms of the body, most of the body is done in 3 resin castings, particularly the very difficult bit on the bunker where you've got those complex curves. So we've tried to make that as foolproof as we can in terms of somebody who doesn't know anything about 7mm modelling, might have come from military modelling or some other background, can actually build that and is almost certain to succeed.
Yeah, it's jolly good. Can I just remind everybody, here we are at the Finney7 meeting, and you're all being very good and keeping your microphones muted. But we are happy for people to unmute and ask questions if you like. But we prefer you to put your questions in the chat box just below. And I know Steph and Richard are raring to go. If anybody's got any questions, anything specific they need to know about one of Finney7's products or how to make them.
Turning into an audience with Finney7 rather than Finney7 Q&A at the moment.
Can I ask a question then, Nick, to both parties? What's the criteria for deciding what particular kit you want to produce? Is it public demand or is it your own feelings? I mean, from a commercial point of view, surely it's got to be public demand, but there may well be, as you mentioned with Martin, that initially it was so he could have stock for his own layout, I think.
Very quickly, as the first point there, public demand is a very fickle thing because people will come along and tell you that they want this and that, and they'll be very keen. And then you produce it, and all of a sudden they've all faded away. So while we are cognizant of what people might say they want, it is actually a decision amongst ourselves for a number of reasons as to what we're going to produce. Might be a particular interest of one of our group, might be because we have a substantial number of the drawings or castings or research material available. It's very rarely a questionnaire to the public of what would you like to see produced.
Oh, that's a shame, because I was going to suggest you do a director kit, because that's another one that I would really like. I noticed that your range is a bit thin on Great Central Railway locomotive guys, if I don't mind saying so.
Nick, I'll build a little on what Richard said and explain to you why we are not likely to do a director. One of the things that we got when we took over Martin's range, of course, is that we got a whole load of his background information on how he had designed his kits. And we also got a great deal of tooling, some of which was usable, some of which wasn't for various reasons. None of this is a reflection on Martin, it's just a reflection on changes in some cases in legislation, changes in what we can get away with asking different suppliers of. But one of the things that's relatively straightforward for us to do is to enhance the range within the areas that the range currently is. So that's London South Western, Great Western, primarily Edwardian classes. That's the larger Gresley locos, and if we could work out a way that we could do more with the LMS castings, we probably would do. What that allows us to do is to develop very efficiently in those areas, because we can make good reuse of the parts that we already have. Now, what also comes into this, which Richard was sort of kind enough to not mention, is that for each of us who are involved in the business, we each have an interest in one or more of the kits that are in the range. So in my case, it's the London South Western stuff, which I think is probably quite well known. And what my ambition was first of all to maintain the London South Western range, but secondly to grow it. And I think there's always a little bit of a tension between modelling what I would really like to model and what is commercially of interest. What I think we're finding out is that, particularly as we are gradually uncovering locos that we can potentially do, is that we're realizing that if we like them and we want them, then there's a great chance that other people will as well.
Mm.
And I have quite a formidable archive in terms of London South Western Railway loco material. And we are able to draw on my archive for the London South Western stuff in the same way that we can draw on the information that's held by other members of the team. Some of you guys may well be aware of my father's photographic collection, for example. So Brian Dale of Finney7 is my father. We have access to all his photographs. That's a fantastic resource for us to be able to draw on as a team, and allows us to approach kits from a kit development in a very personal way. You talk to the guys who are involved in designing kits for the range, that includes me, and we can talk about them with great passion, animation. It's quite entertaining to watch Simon and Mick bouncing up and down on their chairs talking about their current projects. I welcome you to try it. Where the range is going to go fits quite well with what we do at the moment. Where we end up with completely new things, they're not off the picture completely. The consideration that we have to make, though, is that for anything we do that is completely new, is that a complete tool? So we would have to tool everything for that first kit, which means that we would have to be quite confident that the first kit in any particular new railway or any particular new designer would sell in appreciable numbers, so that we could do further follow-on locomotives from that one.
Well, we've got a question here from Carr, who's sat just up there patiently above your head.
Hi, Carl.
He says, hello, at your website, there are more inside motion kits. Are they designed for a typical engine? Are the inside motion kits all the same?
They're definitely not the same. They are designed specifically for the loco in question. So the Duke inside motion kit specifically fits the Duke, but won't necessarily fit anything else. So at the time the kit was designed, the inside motion kit was designed with it. So you would have to ask for an inside motion kit for a specific loco in the knowledge that it will fit that loco, or it will fit our kit of that loco.
Is that the question you were asking? Are you satisfied with that answer, Carl, or would you like to come in and get them to expand on any of that? Happy for you to unmute yourself and join in the discussion if you like. I think he seems quite happy with that.
Nick, it's Martin here.
Hello.
Hello, Martin.
Hi, could I ask Steph a question, please? We've had discussions, as you know, Steph, about D15s in the past.
Yep.
Is there a plan to do a D15 in the range?
We have. So the long and the short of the D15 is.
Can I just stop you for a second? What's a D15? Is it
right? Okay, so D15 is, so you can now tell where we're coming from with this, bearing in mind my previous answer. D15 was Drummond's absolute masterpiece.
Right.
It's a big inside cylinder 440. They are one of my absolute favourite locos, mainly because they are big and ugly and Drummond. So to put a little bit of flesh on those bones, not for you, Martin. One of the kits, which I think is quite well known, that Martin developed for his own layout, was D15. We know that there are errors in the kit as he designed it, and that's why it was never produced in either 4 or 7 mil by Martin. It's because basically he never got round to ironing out the bumps. We know what they are because Martin has told us, and once we are in a situation where we know what's involved in bringing one of those kits to production, which is where the L12 fits in, that is the point at which Richard and I will have a conversation about whether the D15 is one that we will do. The decision will almost certainly not be based wholly on commercial need, because it is a loco which I would love to have in the range, but we need to be realistic about how practicable it is to bring it into production. So it's a fair question. I hope I've given you some sort of thought on where we would go with it. It's not something which I can commit to, because I don't know what's involved in it at the moment, and I think it would be unfair to set an expectation. But it's definitely on our radar.
Okay, Steph, I appreciate the answer. You'll know, perhaps the others won't, my struggles with Mr. Shedmaster's offerings in this particular view.
Me too.
And I'm grateful for everybody else. I'm grateful for Steph's help in the past on this particular project. I'm just really trying to decide whether the current project goes into the forever forgotten bin, and I might do. We'll see how it goes. Thanks very much, Steph.
Okay,
Might be a serious risk of you finishing your project just at the moment that we've released ours.
Yeah.
Always a danger, that kind of thing, isn't it? Do you know, one of the things that's always kind of made me think was you do a lot of resin mouldings in your range, and they always seem to be quite good quality as well. And I know that silicon moulds have quite a limited sort of range, don't they? You can't get many impressions out of them before they're shot. Does that affect your business?
It affects the costing of any model.
Right.
You know, as you rightly say, there is a life to the mould. So we have to recover the costs of the mould and the resin components over the expected life of the mould. That's one of the reasons why the W1 kit was relatively expensive, because it was a complex, large mould that had a shorter life than most of the other moulds we use. That's reflected in the kit cost.
Of course, and you've still got, presumably though, you've still got the original patterns from which the, the resin mould was made.
We do, but every time it's used, it needs to be refurbished to make it ready for the next shot. So it's not a dig the mould out and put it in the post. It's dig the mould out, put a week's work in, and then get it back to the caster. So it's not as straightforward as you might think.
Right. Yeah, I have no idea about these things, I have to say.
That's the reason why you try, unless there is a very profound reason for having a resin mould, it's why the kits will be in brass or nickel silver. They'll be etched.
Sure.
For example, we wouldn't think of doing a resin moulded boiler for the B1 because it's quite unnecessary. But it's why we would for the 94XX with the complex shape of the smoke box boiler, firebox, tanks, the rear of the bunker, particularly if we're aiming it towards the beginner's end of the market.
Sure. Sure. And, the logical extension to this question then is about the other castings that you use, isn't it? The brass and the white metal castings. I mean, are you at the stage now where you can 3D print patterns for those? Or does the technology exist to make it, kind of financially viable to just have them printed in as in a metallic form straight off?
Well, let's Steph to answer that one in detail, but the cost of putting 3D printed items in each kit would be prohibitive.
Right.
Yeah, I think as the abridged version, I think Richard's just expressed it exactly right. At the moment, it's not a production technology. There are exceptions to it. One of the things which you and others are aware of, I'm sure, is that we do 3D printed crank axles. So they are were a direct-to-metal process that we were reliant on buying offshore. We now have bought the approach onshore and are using a printed wax to produce those crank axles. So we can do bespoke cast crank axles in brass, which are based around 3D printed waxes.
Right.
We also use it a little bit for odd items where the insulation is helpful, but it carries a cost. So, for example, as you'll remember, the W1 has insulated brake shoes.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of using it for tooling, for pattern making and mold making, it's just another technique.
Sure, sure. And do you have a view about whether it's better to use, you know, lost wax brass castings or white metal castings at all? I know there's a perception of quality, isn't there, if you get a brass casting, but sometimes it's perhaps more appropriate to do white metal ones. I mean, in my kind of experience, they do tend to be a little bit crisper.
Absolutely. So with current technology, we know that we can get higher resolution in white metal. We're using very, very good caster for white metal. We're using good casters for lost wax as well, of course. But what the judgment that we're making at the moment is primarily based upon strength, because there is an assumption that white metal for larger, bulkier items works better for us because we can get better detail into it. It's much, much better at dealing with larger volumes and lost waxes. But you wouldn't really want a white metal 3-link coupling or a white metal vac pipe or steam heat pipe. So for those sorts of items, we will go to lost wax. So the judgment is primarily upon strength, and not just from the point of view of the finished model, but also from the point of view of during the assembly. So there were a lot of small white metal fittings in some of Martin's earlier kits because he didn't have access to a lost wax process when he started out. We are transitioning a number of those to lost wax for current and future kits in the hope that they make life easier for people to build, because it's easier to solder brass to brass than it is to solder white metal to brass. So the consideration is primarily one of physical strength rather than anything else.
Yeah, I did know
that out a bit, Nick. When we decide we're going to do something as a group, we will discuss what we feel is the best material for a particular application, be it resin, white metal, lost wax, brass. So it's based on our experience as builders, what we want from a kit and what we think works best.
Yeah, I noticed in the past that a lot of Martin's kits, were he did tend to use a lot of fabricated parts, where perhaps a casting would have been easier to assemble for customers, or maybe that was done on on the basis of the cost of producing a pattern for a casting rather than being able to draw the etches out. Obviously, it's much cheaper, isn't it?
I think historically it's been done for accuracy.
Right. Okay.
You can get closer and more accurate with the fit. I assume that you're thinking about things like slide bars, for example.
Well, the thing that sprung to my mind was that years ago I built a Bullied Light Pacific, and I kind of really enjoyed building it. In fact, it was I think it might have even been the first of Martin Finney's kits that I ever built. And the ash pan was made out of dozens and dozens and dozens of etchings that you had to fabricate and fold up into an ash pan. And it did require a little bit of it. It's not a criticism of the quality of the etchings. They were fine, but it did require a little bit of head scratching, to try and work out how they did fit together. But I know I've discussed this with a couple of people that thought, maybe back then Martin might have done better to have put a casting in the kit for that, because it would have made the kit,
The reason that is there is primarily for accuracy.
Yeah.
Better the components, it made much more sense to do it in an X We now have the luxury, as we look at the future kits and as we look at the instructions from the current kits, that we can be more circumspect about those things. So we have the opportunity, for example, on complex assemblies to put more than one instruction stage in a set of instructions. You know, there were cases in Martin's kits where sometimes the expectation of the level of knowledge of the builder was perhaps higher than we assume. You know, we've got the advantage that we can put photographs in our instructions, which was something that wasn't open to Martin when he started, for example. But one of the considerations that we always make with any of the kits is on buildability. So having the conversation that Richard was talking about earlier about when we're going to use resin components, well, the same one that is involved in having that discussion is about how some of the details go together, how the chassis assembly goes together, for example, in order to make sure that we can do it repeatably and also that we know what we can write in the instructions, and it gives us clarity that way. So the emphasis is on fidelity and buildability the whole time. It's a trade-off the whole time.
Sure, sure. I mean, you're ultimately compromised by the fact that the frames are much narrower than they should be prototypically anyway. And
yeah, even in scale 7.
Yeah, and with a lot of your locos are sort of, I don't know, what would you describe them as? Edwardian Victorian engines, you know, where, for instance, the smoke box fits between the frames and the frames stick out above the top of the chassis. And that, you know, and in my experience, the knock-on problem there is that there isn't, if you want to put inside valve gear in a narrowed chassis, it can be quite difficult to fit everything in. And you do end up with a step in the chassis, you know, the bit above the chassis is generally prototypical width, and the section of the chassis that's below the footplate is usually sort of compromised to fit, you know, 29.2 back-to-backs, isn't it? And, you know, it's kind of always a compromise that I think kit manufacturers, designers are always going to come across. That plus the fact that you have to make the thing run around a dinner plate radius as well. I think clearly the loco behind you, you know, is kind of guilty of that, isn't it? You know, it in itself was probably not designed to go around a scale 6-foot radius curve.
I think we'd say with our kits that they must be got round 6 foot.
Yeah.
But if you want to get it round anything less than that, well, we'll help. You're sort of on your own on that one.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably fair.
Yeah.
I know that there are people that have managed to get one of your Duchess kits to do a 5'6" radius curve, but I think the person in question did have to use his angle grinder quite a lot.
Is that on his track or on the kit, Nick?
We don't have the advantage of having gauge widening, do we, or banking of curves? You know, I suppose that would help if people could do that. But yes, I do like the engine behind you, by the way. It's a very nice livery, isn't it?
Yeah, very pretty engine.
So how do you go about problems with engines like that, about bogies, for instance, and pony trucks, you know, that limit the transition around a 6-foot radius curve?
It's always a challenge. It's the universal challenge, Nick. You've picked up on 2 of them. So from a design of where do you do the frames above the footplate, where do you do the frames below the footplate? It's not a unique problem either to Edwardian engines. If you look at later locos, for example, at the front, they will typically have frames protruding through the footplate somewhere. And then how you deal with what should be a straight eye line from above the footplate down to below the footplate becomes a challenge. And, you know, there are tricks that you can use for doing that. But, you know, that's certainly a concern. In terms of getting a loco around corners, though, there are always a variety of ways of solving the problem. Martin actually had some really good ideas in terms of how to set up the geometry of his locos. And in general, I think the times that we see people having difficulties getting chassis to go around corners of our kits, it's because people have I usually say busked, because they've had a go at something on their own. What I can say is that the way that Martin sets up his locos, as you'll recall from the T9s you built, it does work. So constraining, what Martin typically does on the 440 or the 044 tank behind me is he constrains the movement of the rear truck. The M7 that's behind us, in terms of its side plate, is an 062 tank. And what that does is it gives the loco a great deal of stability, but also allows it to go around corners with side control. So that's one thing that we have the advantage of, is we know how Martin did that, and therefore we can reproduce it in our own kits. The other thing which I think all three of us do who are designing complete kits is that we arrange a plot, which gives us the opportunity to work out quite early on, in some way, shape or form. I know some of the guys do it physically, I do it in the computer, of working out where and how we get clearances in a chassis. It's just part of the process. It is, you know, it's something which I believe, looking at other manufacturers, it's one of those things which is typically forgotten in many cases. We're quite conscious of it because we want to make, you know, what are quite highly detailed models usable on a day-to-day basis. It's the same reason why we provide specific recommendations for wheels, motors, gearboxes,
Sure.
And why my range of gearboxes, the SDMP gearboxes, continue to be available, is because they fit the kits.
Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, I know with fine scale standards, you do get a fair bit of slot between the flange and the railhead, which is you know, usually quite a big help. But you know, in your pet locos, a lot of the biggest problem with them often is that the chassis isn't relieved, you know, to allow the wheels of the bogie or the pony truck or whatever it is to pass underneath them.
Yep.
And I'm sure that, you know, those locos were probably designed to some extent to let the wheel clout the chassis anyway. You know, often you see them standing in workshops, don't you, with big wheeled marks on the
Yep.
chassis where the tyres have obviously been scraping away merrily. But I mean, obviously for an electrically powered loco, that's just a bit of a non-runner, isn't it?
The other thing, of course, is that the prototypes have plate frames, which means that much of the way that they get round corners is by the frames moving, and we don't certainly don't have the luxury of being able to do that. So.
No, always a problem, I'm sure. But yeah,
the other thing from a practical point of view when building one is to encourage people to test at every stage. Because the number of issues are, well, I'll finish your model and it won't go around the curves. And the answer is, at what stage didn't it go around the curves? And the answer is, I don't know, because it's fully finished. And the answer is to test every time you add a part to make sure there's no conflict. I've built 3 of our Duchesses now, or rebuilt 3 of our Duchesses, and they will all go around Hayside, my layout, and that has some curves of 5'5" and less. So it is entirely possible to get a model around those sort of curves, but you do have to be aware at every stage what might hit something else, like the relief valves on the front of cylinders, or on the Duchess, the springs on the trailing truck inside the frames. You know, it's knowing where that happens and looking at it under power at each stage. That doesn't mean pushing it through. That means having it under power, so you know how it's going to sort of slew around the curves or through the points.
Yeah, and sometimes it makes a difference as well when the loco's pulling a train, because all of a sudden you've got a big weight on the drawbar that's acting like a lever and wanting to pull the chassis in a direction that, you know, you might not want it to go. I think another advantage, I know there's you know, that it's a bit of a contentious thing to say, but Slater's wheels do actually help you along in this process, because to get the loco equipped with Slater's wheels to short out, it actually has to short out in 2 places, you know, one on each side. You know, I mean, this is sometimes a problem that I've encountered when you're building, for instance, a loco with Alan Harris wheels. And I think all your engines were actually designed to be built with Alan Harris wheels in the first place, weren't they? is that, you know, if you're using the American system, it's much easier for the loco to short out. You only have to touch in one place and you've had it, really.
Well, at the moment on tender locos, I'm just putting pickups on the tender, making sure that's fully insulated from the loco. And while it doesn't mean there aren't shorts, it does mean they're much easier to find.
Yeah, I think our lives will become much easier if battery powered, you know. I have seen some layouts now that have got locos that are powered by mobile phone batteries, you know, and you know, they've got a surprising amount of longevity in them, and it cures all those problems straight away, doesn't it?
I'll tell you a story about that. I've got a customer who has battery powered locos, so I'm putting radio control in them, which is great because you're just building the locos and running it around. And I ran it around the layout and it sparked everywhere and nothing else would move, simply because I hadn't had to bother about wheels shorting against the brake blocks or anything like that. So I thought, yeah, you can't run them both at the same time. Yeah, that's a bit more extra work.
That's right. That's right. You don't have the problem of trying to put your pickups somewhere out of sight that don't interfere with the suspension or the pickups don't interfere with the suspension or the inside valve gear, and it's, you know.
Yeah, you need to use split axles, Nick.
No, I would never. That's just introducing a problem that you.
What you really need is steam, and that makes it all
steam.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that either.
Am I right in thinking, guys, that Simon was demonstrating some form of battery power on your stand, not at the last Gildex? Sorry?
That was myself.
Was it you? Right.
The old 12 was fitted with battery power.
Right. And is that part of the sort of business, coming into the business plan, or is it just something?
No, that's just what the customer wanted.
Right.
So, Steve, it's one of those things where, you know, the same way that we don't have any commercial interest in DCC, we think it's something which we need to have more than peripheral awareness of.
Yeah.
So if people ask, you know, how are you getting it to work? How are you getting it to fit? Richard has some good experience of it. You're right. Simon has as well. I don't recall it being on the stand though, but
I seem to recall. I don't know which show it was.
He's only done the 9F radio control.
No, this was quite a small tank engine. I'd invited Simon to a show, and we were talking about, and he said, "Well, have you seen this?" And he said, "It's completely battery powered."
Okay.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, I'm certainly aware that he's working on it, but I mean, it's one of those things that we, you know, knowing about it means that we can perhaps provide people some ideas, if not actually some solutions. With the locos I'm designing, for example, one of the things that I'm doing is trying to make sure that the voids inside the loco bodies are clear, so that people can fit sound, people can fit DCC. It opens the space up for batteries, for controllers. But it's difficult to do. It becomes another thing. And if it ends up compromising some other aspect of the design, it's the first thing which goes, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
But we've got to be cognizant of it.
I did have problems building a pair of two of the RW1s that I built. One of them went to a customer that insisted on having a steam generator inside the body and sound, and therefore he needed to have quite a big decoder, you know, that had the rectifier that was big enough to give you the output that you needed to drive all the various functions the loco needed. In addition, he wanted it to pull 12 coaches, you know, 12, which is fair enough because the loco did pull 12 coaches. Didn't seem like an unreasonable thing to ask. But the spec was that the loco had to weigh somewhere in the region of 2 kilos. And when you've got all of those things crammed inside the body, it's quite difficult to find a metal that's got the right density, that's not radioactive, you know, to be able to make your loco weigh a couple of kilos.
Yeah, but that's the point. I mean, on a large loco like that, you have the option to be able to use the tender. I don't know whether you did Nick, or not.
Yeah. I mean, it ended up being the way to go. A lot of the electronics did have to go in the tender, but the big problem with DCC then is you end up with a massive wiring harness, don't you, between the tender and the loco, which sometimes affects the way the loco travels. And it's not something you want to see either, I don't think.
No. But the logic with that is that if they can do it in HO and arguably these days in N, O-gauge really shouldn't be a problem.
It's very useful because I put the radio control in an M7 and the entirety of the radio control went in the bunker. And I think that's quite a useful exercise to show what sort of space you can get it into. It wasn't easy, but nevertheless, it did all go in the bunker with a normal coal load.
Yeah, it turned out plutonium's quite dense, but I'm sensing that people perhaps didn't want a loco stuffed full of plutonium. But anyway, back to your range, because we seem to have, kind of wandered off track a little bit here. One of the questions that I know you keep getting asked is about the Aberdare. When's the Aberdare coming out?
That's a little way down the list. We will get all the rest of the Great Western Range out before that, because there are issues on making it easy to build, particularly the chassis. So we're completely redesigning the chassis on that. A lot of legwork has been done, but it's not yet available. So that's going to be some way back, which is a pain for us because it's one of the most requested logos.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Not going to release it until we're happy it works properly.
Jolly good. Oh, do we have a question?
Yes, please.
Hello.
Fire away.
Hello.
You're on screen. Do ask your question. Just ask it directly.
I'd like to ask what those 9-volt batteries were that were recommended, small 9-volt, because I'm using that 9 volts on radio control battery power, and I can't get it into a tank engine.
If you haven't got a lot of space, the best system to go for is that's called ProtoCab, because that uses one of the very small flat batteries that then has its output stepped up to 12 volts. So it's a much better solution, is what I put in the bunker of the M7. It's a much better solution than having, say, 6 or 9 of the round AAA batteries. So I would suggest that you have a look at the ProtoCab radio control system, because that is a much more compact system than the traditional battery powered system.
Sorry, I can't really hear you clearly.
Okay. Have you heard of ProtoCab?
No.
Right. Do you use the internet to search products?
Can do.
Right. Type in ProtoCab exactly as it is spelt.
Yeah.
It's made by a firm called ACCS, that is ACC ampersand ESS.
Yeah.
And have a look at their website, because their system is extremely compact.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
It certainly helps, yes.
Good.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you for chipping in.
Right. But incidentally, the rest of my layout is on stud contact, and I have no problems of these shorting out from they'll have.
Excellent.
I never thought of that.
24 volt stud outside.
24 volts. Wow.
I haven't seen that for a while.
Steph's just offered his apologies. He's had to shoot off to go to another meeting.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask them if you do. Anyone? Maybe I could ask a question of Richard if that's the case. Are all of your products these days etched in nickel silver rather than brass?
No, the products from the original Martin Finney range, the photo tools and system is designed that they're etched in a mix of brass and nickel silver. Generally nickel silver for the chassis and some of the formers. Brass tends to be for the bodies, and we haven't changed that. What is happening for future products is that we are switching to nickel silver. So as you're aware, all the W1 was nickel silver. The 94XX will be nickel silver, and we are tending to look to that as the standard for the etched components.
Jolly good, yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people think it solders up a lot better, doesn't it? Nickel silver, it tends not to ripple quite as easily.
Indeed, there are advantages. There are some disadvantages. It can be difficult to roll if you've got to form a boiler out of it. But then the art is in choosing the right thickness of nickel silver and reinforcing it as appropriate. So there are ways around that one.
Yeah, that was what I would say too. You know, it does solder very nicely, but it is much more difficult to form the parts.
Can it be annealed? Nickel silver?
Oh, I tend to avoid annealing like the plague for anything. Right. I think it can impart stresses and buckling and twisting that you really don't want.
No, I'd agree with that. I always sort of do it as a very, very last resort.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it works better on tubes and rods, doesn't it, rather than on flat pieces.
Then the art is getting the right, semi-hard, basic material that's etched, rather than have something that's hard, and that can help as well.
Jolly good. So you've got no plans for doing a director, but how about modern image? Have Finney7 got any plans to dip their toe into the modern image pond at all?
Not particularly. We have discussed that because a number of us, for example, not Mum and myself, would love to do a Kobo or something like that. But then the risk is that Helgen come along and do it, or Dayfol decide to do it. So I think that's a bit of a commercial risk, to be honest. Steph would like to do the kerosene castle. He wouldn't thank me for telling you that. But again, that's a very limited market appeal. So we've got our work cut out, getting out, the rest of the Great Western range, the 94XXB1, the other LSWR locomotives that we want to do. So we can not quite kick it into the long grass, but it's certainly a long way down the list.
So you've got no plans for doing an EM1 or an EM2 or anything like that then?
No.
We're obviously thinking along the same lines there, Nick. I was just about to ask the same question.
I think that's because we probably come from the same part of the country, isn't it?
Probably.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes,
Could I ask a question?
Of course.
Duchess, would it be possible to build City of Stoke-on-Trent on your Duchess?
Yes, except for the tender. I have a memory that there's something different.
It's different about the tender,
on Stoke-on-Trent. So
got rivets on it, I think.
Yeah, so the kit doesn't allow for that. But if you've got a good picture and can do your own rivets, then there's no reason why it can't do it at all.
First Duchess I ever saw. I had a wonderful week's education in the 60s. I bunked off school, me and two mates. As you can guess, we've got a Welsh accent, and we went up Central Wales line every day, usually ending up in Crewe. But the first time we went into Shrewsbury, City of Stoke-on-Trent was ex-works running on a light engine, well, not light engine, just run into Shrewsbury. And I've never forgotten that image. Brilliant.
Well, what I would suggest is you go through some source material to find out what the tender looked like.
Yeah, I got
and
some.
And then look at our kits online, or look at the tender kit online, and just have a look at the etched components to see how much work would be entailed to modify the tender. I don't think it's very much, but I'm aware that there is a reason, and I think it's a tender.
Yes,
why
it is.
our kit doesn't do Stoke-on-Trent.
Could I just come in
You're not
here,
the first
please?
person to ask that. Yes, please do.
Could I just come in here, please, Richard?
Indeed.
I believe that there are some excellent stick-on rivets that you can get, particularly from America. I'm not sure who does them, and the pictures I've seen are very good.
Okay.
There's a firm called Archers who do resin-based rivets. They're best put on as part of the finishing process. So a gloss surface on which you attach them. I have used them. I used them on a Aspinall saddle tank to produce a different pattern of rivets on the saddle tank, and they were spectacularly successful. I do find if you put them directly onto brass or metal, they will dry up and drop off. But there's certainly no reason why they can't be used, and they're very straightforward to use.
What did you say the name was again?
Archers.
Archers. Okay.
They do all sizes and sorts of rivets. They do weld lines, louvres. It's basically a resin print onto a water slide surface. You may have issues about the background carrier film, which is why you want to cut as close as you can to the row of rivets or the louvre, and why you want to put it onto a gloss surface. But nevertheless, it's a very effective tool if you don't want to do it the traditional way.
Okay, thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Just another question, please, Richard.
Yeah.
Have you any plans for any more LMS locos after the Duchess?
Not initially. It all depends on that's a personal interest issue. And that if one of our members feels suitably motivated to design something, that may happen. But it's not in the scheme of works of new models that we are going to do. The LMS, I feel, is pretty well covered by a lot of other manufacturers. You know, Mick Davis has gone on record that he'd like to do a Princess, but you know that is really a long way away and not in our current list.
Thanks very much for that.
Okay.
Richard, thank you for that. We're coming towards the end of the session, and there was just one question that's come up is in relation to the B1 again. So, Richard, I'm wondering if you could just possibly reiterate the
Position. Yeah.
The position for the B1, and then we'll ask if we can end the session. If that's okay with you.
That's fine. The B1, the etches are all done. All the design work has been done for the castings, and we're now at the stage where we are productionizing the castings. We then have to do a test build, photograph it, and write the instructions. So while the end is in sight, we're not there yet, and I'm not going to give a date that it's going to be released, but it is certainly being worked on alongside the getting the rest of the Great Western kits out.
Thanks for that, Richard. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Finney7 would like to thank you for that.
Thank you indeed.
And we'll call the session to an end now. Thank you. I hope you've all enjoyed the show. So
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
bye now.
Bye.